And here we are. A week has passed, and we're still here to chat, Theo.
Yes, of course. Super great, super duper great. Things are going really well. Yeah, there's been such a very good few days. So it's been a long time since we chat, Luca, and so we are ready to rock and roll again for another session.
And today we talk about OpenAPI.
OpenAPI, come on.
Not to be confused with OpenAI, just
with a
letters
P.
to make a huge difference, right?
Also, not to be confused with Swagger, and we need to talk about Swagger.
Well, but then, I mean, once upon a time, right, there
in
was
a faraway land.
In a faraway land, in a faraway universe where unfortunately we both kind of lived. That's why we know about Swagger. There was Swagger.
Yes. What year was there was Swagger? Let's check. Let's do fact checking live, okay? Because that's what I'm doing all the time. So Swagger, okay. The Swagger API project was created in 2011 by Tony Tam.
2011, so 14 years ago.
Yeah.
Wow. 14 years ago, Theo, can you imagine? We were not even 30. We were still kind of like young kids running around.
Yes.
But what was kind of like the big breakthrough with Swagger?
So, okay. The big breakthrough for Swagger is, okay, everybody was developing things with JSON and HTTP, okay? But turns out that, I don't know what, we have this saying, this thing in Italy that, buttare il bambino con l'acqua sporca, for all our Italian friends. I don't know if you can translate it directly in English, okay?
I think you breach any sort of like
code of conduct. Okay,
politically correct.
Okay, let's keep. If you are not Italian, well, I'm sorry. Okay,
just Google it.
Just Google
enable subtitles, and you can see how you say in Italian, and then put it into Claude for a translation.
So what happened? That once upon a time there was Corba, then there was SOAP. Okay. And the key part, and in the meanwhile, there was a stint with some Java RMI stuff. Then there was Java Beans. Then there was, well, it was a lot of things.
.NET was a big.
Anyway, whenever you're building distributed systems, okay, you need to clearly declare the interface between two components, okay, so that when these two components talk over the network, they can agree on the formats of the data being transferred. Okay, I don't know. Later on, gRPC. Okay, if you want to take up some other thing, there is an interface. Okay, there's functions. There is an interface. The interface, the data that you send to the interface matches the function. Okay, it's perfectly great. Works super well. But then, when the word before then was using SOAP and WSDL. Okay, long time ago, I wrote a lot of WSDL and SOAP things based on XML. They were super complex, but they worked, relatively well.
So because people might actually not like the way things are pronounced, we say WSDL, right?
Yeah. That's okay. So we have,
I know that JOT was not really well perceived, but that's actually how it's also called. But we call it JWT. This one we call it
anyway, the WSDL. Okay. Okay, so the WSDL was the definition for SOAP messaging. Now, this is super useful. So when moved to a HTTP word, JSON word, okay, HTTP plus JSON, well, there was no real way in which you could define the interface of an HTTP plus JSON API in a way that made sense. So,
you mean more declarative, right? Than,
well, just this is the API. You deal with it. This is the data. You deal with it. Call it and see what it returns. Yeah, that's the problem, right? So we wanted a machine readable definition. Okay, why do we want a machine readable definition? Well, because given a machine readable definition, you can generate clients automatically. Okay,
That was the real reason.
well, it makes sense, right? It's creating clients is such a huge waste of time. Okay, it's something that every machine can do. Okay, you can ask an AI to create a client. Given that, it's probably creating a good. It will probably go today. It will do a good enough job. So anyhow,
Yeah.
the gist of all of this is we ended up needing this specification. This specification was created, okay, and then later on, I think it becomes super popular everywhere. Like I think almost all API these days offer an open API. So originally it was called Swagger, then Swagger 1, Swagger 2. Then it became Open API because it was donated to the public. But thank you, Smart Bear, that donated this. You can still see the Smart Bear logo in a lot of the Swagger UI component, which is still super popular and used by a lot of companies. So it's pretty great.
And so the time of Swagger was gone, it became OpenAPI because, like in many open source projects or projects in general, there was the need to create a consortium, right, where different stakeholders could actually influence the growth of this specification, right?
Yes,
absolutely.
absolutely.
Truth is to be told, we as Platformatic are part of the OpenAPI initiative. And I mean, I have to say one thing that I think the interesting part about being part of a foundation of an initiative, right, because it's the Linux Foundation with different initiatives underneath, is that you get so many different angles on how people are trying to solve problems using a unified definition, that I don't think at the time of Swagger that thing could actually grow as a standard as fast as it's doing right now. Like you just said, basically it's the standard for defining and documenting APIs.
Yes.
Everywhere, right? Like we can agree on that.
Yes. Yes. Also because with version 3, okay, it converged with JSON schema, which it was the biggest problem. Like they were mostly similar but not identical. Okay. With version 3, it converged with JSON schema. So now you can essentially have your validators interpret the Swagger definitions, the OpenAPI definitions, and essentially combine them in a uniform flow. Okay.
But let's kind of like explain to everyone why. I mean, we mentioned about the clients, so we move to some sort of like semi-contract based handshake.
You mentioned something very important here, Luca. Okay, so there are two main philosophies when developing APIs. Okay, and I have a rough feeling that you like one and I like the other. So we can get some spicy on the discussion. Okay, so when designing APIs, okay, there is a typical way of this is done in a lot of enterprises and companies. You do a big meeting with everybody involved. Okay, you design the contract of that API that should work for both the client and the server. Okay, then the server goes in their merry way and they implement that contract, and the client goes their merry way and they consume that contract. Then they meet a month later on. Okay, and share notes, and everything in theory should work perfectly fine.
If you're putting me in that school, I'm definitely not in that school.
Okay. So you're not in that school. Perfect. Then we are both in the other camp. Okay. This is typically what is called
API governance.
API governance and model API driven. Okay, to some extent. I think it's API. What's the term here?
No, this is model driven development.
Model driven development. Is model driven development is it's Let's call the right term. Let's see.
It's kind of like the uh, uh, well, in enterprise, to be very honest, it's even called, we call it resource driven.
Even worse.
Because then there is rest involved, right?
Of
Remember that
course,
there is.
of course.
But what do you think, Theo? If I can ask you just a question, like, it jumped to my mind, and I don't want to forget it, but
Mhm.
maybe we can pin it for later. My question is about why people always confuse REST with OpenAPI.
Okay, so this is funny. Nobody does REST.
No,
It-
everyone does REST.
no.
That's what they tell to themselves every day
Yes,
in
that's
front of
what
the
they
mirror.
tell to themselves every day. Okay. However, I argue that most people have not read the Royfielding thesis. Okay, so if you have not read that thesis, okay, you probably are not doing. You don't know what representational state transfer is, and therefore you are not doing it. Okay, the key concept of all of that is hyperlinks. Okay, and the fact that you have links between multiple resources. Okay,
The so-called hypermedia API.
nobody does this. I've never seen this done. And every single time I've seen this done, the performance of it were so bad that really you should not have been doing it in the first place. Okay.
I think the biggest problem of hypermedia, well, without going into the future of OpenAPI, right, with Arazzo and so on, but hypermedia, I think, was a good idea to doing state representation, right? That was good. But at the same time, it was the same kind of like infinite trap that everyone fell into, right? Or either having one link or 1,000 links to follow for each property, right? And then basically having this blast of requests to basically get my product information. I don't know. Because the idea was that basically to do the same thing as GraphQL does, but in REST format. To be very honest.
Um, so I found the term. Okay. So the term is API first design approach versus code first design approach.
Oh, okay. You mean the circle around the table versus
Yes. So the generic part is so that there is this concept of the big meeting as we discussed, where everybody designed the API together. Okay. Then one goes the one merry way, the other goes the other merry way. Okay. Um, and in my experience, okay, the end result is
is a
the backend.
divorce.
It doesn't. Nothing works when you try to integrate it. Never. Okay. Ever, because most of the time the architects that design those open API definition create monsters. Okay, and really that should not be conceived. Okay, so by the way, guys, if you are an architect designing an open API spec, if you see in your open API the use of a lot of one off, any off, if then else, then very likely you're doing it wrong. Okay, to be clear, I'm very strong on this. Okay, if your first edition of the first version of your spec uses this, you will not know what happens at the 10th version of that spec. Of like it's Those tools are very useful for mature projects when you want to grow and support multiple versions, multiple things of the same thing.
Yeah, but
But look, if you put an if then else in a config, in a API, how can somebody write the client for it? The code that call that. Okay, it's going to be very hard. Okay, anyhow, going back to the point of how it's done. So API first design approach, code first design approach. Then you meet the at the end. Okay, what happens is after all said and done, they need to reconcile of these, early integrate often, and change the API contract so that it works for the client, it works for the server. Okay. Typically, the client needs slightly different APIs because they don't know their API beforehand. Okay. and the server doesn't. The server will probably say, no, this design that you have done is not. Do a different one because this one is never is going to be always slow. Okay, or I need to maintain 5 index table to
Exactly.
actually get the response in a short amount of time for this one. So and keeping that up to date is going to take 1 second every time I do a write because of all the indexes. So probably not a good idea. So generically, it's the flow is typically a little bit more fluid. Okay, I think from my point of view, generically doing a starting point on having a draft spec is good. Okay, a draft spec works. Uh, but then typically, I recommend switching to a code first approach where the spec is integrated with the code that is going to run and generated from the code is going to be run. Okay. So you don't want your API to be, oh, this is my API document, and then the routes read the doc. Okay. My recommendation is you write your routes with the validation of those routes in line with your code. Okay. And then from this, you create the OpenAPI definition doc. Okay. Now, the reason why you do all of that is because the validation of your routes is close to your code. Okay. It's something that's really needs to be really tied
Correct.
to your route logic. Okay. Those two things are super tied together. Okay.
Yeah, it's your communication interface, right?
It's your communication interface. So so when you write a function, you put the definition of your function on the first line. Okay. You don't put in another file. Okay. Sorry, folks.
Well, in C++, you do it, right? Header
Yes, and we see where all of that went. So it's probably, I have nightmares for this.
or in
It's
C, I'm not discriminating on C++.
no, but you copy
C,
it again. Okay, so you put it there, but then you put it again.
yeah,
So you define it once in the interface, then you put it again at the top of the function.
yeah, but it's like actually I'm not against the contract-driven development. Like I'm not against. I think it's a good way to have this handshake, right, between
Yeah.
client and server. The only thing that I personally feel a huge waste of time is this all kind of like a shebang of creating a generic API manually versus having a system to tell me what the generic API would be for all the system needing to connect to that. You know what I mean, right? We make always a design that is, I give you an example. When I was working in this large telco that we cannot name, but you can go on LinkedIn and find out the name. It was like an API first approach with the contract-driven development, resource-driven development, blah, 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 blah.
Where the API contract signed in blood.
No, we had, I probably cannot say, I shouldn't, but I don't care. There were millions of dollars invested in an initiative to build a portal for enterprise architects to basically bless or not API definitions.
Wow.
Yeah, and then you ask them the difference between an integer and a double, and they didn't know it. So that tells you everything.
Well, yeah, I have been in those meetings where I was interfacing with in a
I
team.
call them the void star orb. You know
There
the
is. There was one that was expert in OpenAPI. One was expert in writing clients.
yeah.
One was an expert with CQRS. All of them got a salary, and they was just like, okay.
I don't know, but don't you think? And once again, I think you and I we call it a banter just because we just go left and right. But we started with what exactly OpenAPI is and what they try to kind of like solve, right? To have
Yep.
a documented way to represent basically APIs. But the more I think about the standard and the implementation, I think once again we made a huge mistake. We as technologists, right? I mean, the biggest problem is, and correct me if I'm wrong, Theo, because we basically kind of like sit around that table shouting, this is the right way to do the API. reality tells us, like you just said, that when we all go back to that table, nobody can agree that something was correctly working, right?
No.
But then my question is, why we had in the last episode the same question: should be a primitive, a consequence, right, or a direct result, right? So the thing is, shouldn't OpenAPI a post-generated, unified vision on that API?
Oh, I
That,
am absolutely behind that statement. Okay, there is only one problem with that statement. Okay, like I agree with the statement. I agree with the fact that considering OpenAPI, the API definition, a result of the implementation of the
yeah.
backend, and and of the front end, to be honest, at the same time, and of at least one client at the
Mm.
same time. Okay, you are not going to design a good OpenAPI definitions without a good client that covers most of the use cases of that
I
API.
agree. I agree.
Okay, by the way, so otherwise you end up in a lot of back and forth on the header on the HTTP requests. So anyhow, you don't do that. There is a catch, okay, a big one, okay, which is an advantage that you have with GraphQL compared to OpenAPI generically. Okay, OpenAPI is less robust to breaking changes on the API itself. Okay,
Mm.
you can use some techniques to make APIs more flexible. Okay, like any off, one off, and these kind of things. Okay, if then else in these kind of things, but uh, um, over time your specification become very, very, very problematic. Okay.
But doesn't it change from? Sorry if I interrupted, but the came kind of like natural question. Don't you think that is kind of like we are kind of like abusing of the linearity of a specification, now making it become something that is this Frankenstein, where like
Absolutely,
any off,
absolutely. But
if then else.
that's the problem, right? That's the problem of it. Okay. So the problem is because I have different needs, different customers
Mm.
of different clients of that API, and they have different needs. I might need different fields. I might need different things being passed and set. Okay, and therefore causing problems. Okay, in at the implement down the line at the implementation level over time when
Mm.
those needs to all those different needs needs to be fulfilled. As
You mean
imagine that imagine
well,
two clients that have completely different requirements, okay,
yeah,
which typically goes, the one is the web team and the other one is the mobile team. They have never have a single requirement in common in my experience. Okay.
no, which is kind of like expected, right?
Yes, but this means that when you build these APIs, on what I've done in a lot of cases is typically either the web team or the mobile team, okay, or in some cases even both,
Yeah,
okay, create an API wrapper over an OpenAPI internal OpenAPI spec
yeah,
because combine providing more coarse-grained APIs on top, okay, that actually combine multiple API internal API calls because doing that actually allowed a much shorter round trip time over
yeah,
this long connection, especially on mobile. Okay, when you are on mobile, typically you want to, you're fetching some data because you are on 4G or 5G and so on. You want to have all the data requirement to visualize that page. Okay, more or less receiving all of that in one blob,
yeah.
with one round trip, because that round trip can actually take some time. So you don't want to receive a bunch of data, then having to issue multiple queries, because a lot of sometimes, let's say you have a product content, and then you have another one that another API to retrieve the colors of that product of that product, okay, or the variants. Now,
Mm.
doing that, you want to have one single blob that contains all the data in one single round trip. Okay, On the front end, these might not be needed because one the other thing might be beyond the fold, and so on and so forth, and it can be lazy loaded. Okay, I'm just making some examples on things where they can do things differently, which is totally fine. But when you design an API, it's the same API for both. Okay. Um, and then typically you end up creating a wrapper on top of an internal API, which is an API of an API. Okay. To combine multiple things and provide coarse grained stuff. Okay. Now, the advantage of something like GraphQL, okay, is that it's because it has fragments, it has a lot of high level concept that allows to the that allows to specify the request, okay, the data to be fetched in a way more coarse grained way with a lot of properties, a lot of objects all together. That actually is provides a much more robust way to support multiple use cases and the growth of that API. Okay. You only need to be careful of almost never removing anything from GraphQL, and
Well,
more or less.
that's kind of like the rule of thumb for, versioned kind of like system, right?
Yes, but in some cases with OpenAPI, with REST and OpenAPI and JSON schema, you almost can't.
Yeah. But what do you think, Theo? Because I noted down before I forgot. I didn't want to interrupt you while you were talking, but I, I have the impression of that something is happening. That we take, when I say we, I take responsibility, right? Being part of a group of technologists, and I also drag you in. We are basically taking a spec and transform it because of our mental model to in kind of like inheritance based system. Like in our brain we have inheritance as a way to optimize things on how they're built, right? So you
Oh
have
gosh.
a base spec, and then you put on a permutation of that, and that's, I think, actually what happened with OpenAPI, right? We try to basically build object-oriented and inheritance-based system on top of a spec that was meant, I think, to be very linear. But I don't know. What do you
Oh,
think?
look, yes. I don't understand those part of the spec. Like, I don't know. I almost never used them too. Okay. So in the OpenAPI spec, you can define something called you can define some components, okay,
Yeah,
that can be reused. Those are just essentially JSON schema blocks. Okay. And you can say, for example, that you have a person or a product. Okay. And a
yeah,
product is composed of those set of properties. And some of them can be optional, some of them can be required, and so on and so forth.
yeah,
Now you can take that product, okay, and use it everywhere. Okay. Now, but then it comes a problem. Okay. And this is where it falls apart for me. Okay.
yeah,
So when I read a product, okay, I retrieve a product, I want that product to always have the ID defined. So the ID is always in. Okay.
yeah,
But then when uh, if I want to reuse the same schema in my when creating a product, okay, I don't want the user to specify the ID.
yeah,
Okay, and then I need to have actually two different specs for this. Okay. On top of that, there is the concept of, oh, maybe I just want to update one field of my product. Okay. Now, if I only want to update one field of my product, should I send the full product?
exactly.
Okay. Um, so yeah, these are the problems that I am seeing a lot of the time with those kind of things. I generically prefer verbose in those settings. So I really prefer having blobs and blobs and blobs of JSON schemas. Okay. Maybe using some internal tooling to be able to express them correctly. So generate them in code and having some
Oh, okay, that's what you mean. So to do code first approach,
yeah.
and then as an outcome, you generate the spec.
I got this massive blob and I don't care. Okay. Typically, when you see these big inheritance, okay, chains, it's when it's being created by architects. Okay. And
I don't really get it because, like, to be honest with you, even if I think about standard, because we took it one step further, right?
yeah.
All this madness. I take the frame of calling madness, but like in telco, there is a spec called TMF. That is the overarching, universal, standardized way of building API for telco. The
Ooh.
promise was every telco will implement and all telco will talk together. Hold on.
Did it work, or there was
No, no,
another
no,
one
no, no,
after
no,
it?
no, no,
Because
no. I was sitting at that meeting, right? I clearly didn't last long. It's a spec, right? We were discussing extensions. Like, you give me a spec, and the first thing you want to discuss is the way to diverge from the spec. Weren't here to just like understand a common language to communicate between things. Same thing is open banking. Same
oh,
exact stuff, right? Same thing is Swift, another standard of communication for intrabanking. But I mean, why don't you just like then give me generate a bunch of code that is managed by a CI/CD and I get all updates, right? And I'm forced to update, and then you control it from a central entity. Don't give me the power of a universal protocol and then tell me that the first thing I can do is to write my own extension for it and make it my own. Because then the standard doesn't exist anymore, right? I understand that there is a divergence between, so there is a demarcation line from standard and specification, right? And OpenAPI is a specification, right? We agree, right? It's a
yes,
spec,
yes.
but then why do you give me a DSL? Why do you give me like a specific way of writing stuff when the first thing I can do is to take your OpenAPI spec, because that's how TMF communicates, and then I can write my own extension. Then basically you don't even know what you can call from me, because in my extension I can make fields required, not only optional, required. Hey, yeah, hey, yeah. Eh. So my question to you, because you and I saw a bunch of manure of shit right around,
No,
but
don't do this. Making a field required.
yeah. But
It
it's
breaks
common.
open. Oh, yeah, it breaks interoperability every
But
single.
but 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 then going back to your point, right? And I just don't want to sell what we did at Platformatic. But you remember when we just said, why do I need to care about? Well, first of all, the idea came from Fastify. That from a Fastify set of routes, we can generate the OpenAPI spec, right?
Yes.
Because at the end of the day, developers don't like to write documentation. We agree on that. And
Zero.
developers will always have permutation of anything that is given to them because it never
Yep.
fits, right? It never fits.
Yep.
Then in Platformatic, what we actually came out with is like a way that we can generate a client. So I can consume that generated protocol, that generated interface. I can consume it without having to maintain it, right? Because a Platformatic client can be running automation. I mean, it's just a command line. It's not like, I mean, it's not so fancy. It's a command line that generates a bunch of JavaScript, right? So theoretically, I could have a job in my CI/CD that always downloads or always keep hydrated. You could do it with Theo. What's the name of the? Oh my God, the tool in GitHub that keeps the dependencies up to date.
Dependabot.
Dependabot, right? Theoretically, right? If you put your API spec in a repository that is auto-generated, the API change it depend about right.
Yeah, the problem. Okay, the problem with generically a code first approach. Okay, this is the problem that I've hit a lot of the time. Okay, is in order to generate clients. Okay, to have a spec, you need to run the software, and you
Mm,
need to run the software, and the software typically need database connections and a bunch of other
mm,
things to run, and therefore it's tricky to get the schema out from there in a like it requires work to keep the schema produced on disk, okay,
mm.
for clients to be generated and so on and so forth. It's probably the biggest problem for that approach.
Yeah, but there are a million of ways, right, that you can do
Yes,
it,
of course.
right? You mentioned AI, right? So
Yeah.
that could be probably. But I'm checking the time, just sensitive of like how far we are. We passed the half an hour. Um, okay, but now I generate my spec, right? So Theo, and versioning, because we every time we talk about API, the main question is always versioning. I have multiple questions around that. Is versioning for a single service, for aggregated service? How do you actually handle it? What's your take on versioning and OpenAPI?
Mm.
Don't tell me that you would write an extension for that because that is gonna be.
I'm definitely going to write an extension. Now that you mentioned, let's write an extension, Luca, for versioning.
It's kind of like I was checking my phone before somebody can actually hear me talking about the extensions, and the people from TMF. I'm gonna be under my house, like probably like in the masonry, covering me with a hat and moving me
Yeah,
to
they
some
are
sort
going
of
to stalk
secret
you,
location. Yeah.
then find out where you live. Find out where you live. Well, it's probably known by everybody. Find out where you live, stalk you underneath, grab you when you exit. I don't
In
know.
a yeah, in a van, take me to this secret location where there's the
And it's a
the
telco location, considering because they are the TMFs.
so there's gonna be for sure an antenna there. I'm gonna be like fried by the 5G, like many would say, and then discuss about this extension. But
So
I was asking you about this because with this all MCP stuff that
yeah,
is
yeah.
going on, right? I mean, do you want to jump into that? Because I mean, we're gonna end up there, and before we end at three
Yeah.
minutes to
So
the end,
before, let's talk about versioning. Okay.
but
So
are
the big
correlated, right?
well,
They're
the first
correlated.
thing you know about versioning is you need in order to so whenever you have an API, okay. So whenever you have an API, you need to store the artifact, okay, that API specification somewhere on disk, okay. Then when you have a client for it, typically you generate those clients. We have a client generator, but use whatever works for you. Pick your poison. Platformatic client works great. Okay, you take that client. Okay, you have you take the client. Okay, now you have this pack in two places. Okay,
Mhm.
this means that this pack can get out of date and there can
Yeah.
be breaking changes here. Okay, now if there is a breaking change and you're trying to deploy and the server makes a breaking change, now the server needs to essentially go and update all the clients, which you don't want to do that. And more importantly, they want to know and not break everybody. Okay, they don't want to break everybody. They always, whenever you ship a breaking change in an API, they break somebody. Okay, so how do you
Remember to
know?
update your API, semantic versioning.
Yeah. Goodbye. Okay, so goodbye. Doesn't happen. Never seen it happen. Anyway, so
Sorry, Tom Preston. It was a good idea, but the problem is always that people don't like good ideas.
um, so anyhow, this is the problem for versioning.
But
So
I just want to, I think people that are listening to us, they are probably, I don't know if they're curious. Maybe half of the audience is into, probably they are a fan of writing extensions. The other half they want to hear about the current elephant in the room in the social medias, right?
oh, MCP.
MCP,
We should do we
authentication.
should do a session on MCP, Luca. You know,
NCP is a time machine. I
So
should make a hat. I should make a hat for
you should make a hat
MCP.
to MCP. MCP is a time machine. Okay, this is a good one. So MCP is probably so it's first of all it's changing super fast. Okay, it's tough problem. Okay, to solve mostly because it's built for coarse-grained tools. Okay, in order to be effective, for example, okay, you need to be able those tools needs to do a lot of things. Okay, like for example, listing all files in a tree. Okay, in a directory. This is a good MCP thingy. Okay, um, it's good. Okay, those tools are good, but when you do these kind of things, you end up in trouble most of the time. Okay, because they uh, uh, those tools, they are so generic. Okay, and then they rely on the fact that the AIs essentially can adapt very quickly. And they even have mechanism to communicate that they have their APIs has changed during a session. Okay, so they can say that to the API, hey, there is a new version of me, so you can we change the parameters. Like, look, like it's.
But don't you think that actually, I mean, we went from RPC based system with SOAP,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Then we moved to REST, where we said
yeah,
RPC is bad. We need to go resource based.
yeah.
Then we went to GraphQL, which is RPC.
Yeah, it's not true. It's fantastic.
It is GraphQL. It's his own space, and then we are falling back into RPC. Because come on,
Yes,
MCPs are just like SOAP, same exact.
it's JSON RPC on top. Like it's JSON RPC.
Sure, but
Like
it's
it's
still,
JSON schema. It has JSON schema. Okay, so
yeah, but it's the
it has
same.
JSON schema.
Is an action based communication,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Right.
Well, it has resources too, by the way.
Sure, but I mean, you can always put lipstick on a pig, but it's still a pig at the end of the day,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I mean, the way the protocol communicate. But what's your stand about the whole authentication angle there? Like, that there is this discussion where we are breaking the contract of authentication in MCP. There's no standard on how we can actually
Okay.
authenticate
The
consistently.
problem there is really solid. Okay. Now, the fundamental problem of MCP, okay, and the problem. So you have, okay, there's currently no way, but this is a problem on the clients, okay?
Yeah.
So all of this has been solved before and it will be solved again, okay? It's the first way of solving this was called auth 2 or auth 1, then we had auth 2, okay? Probably we'll have auth 3 to or some equivalent to
Yeah.
handle MCP, okay? The fundamental problem is you have your IDE or your client, MCP client, okay, AI assistant, whatever, okay. So there is the MCP client, okay, which is a program that runs typically on your computer or on your web browser, okay.
Yeah.
There is an LLM API, okay,
Yeah.
which is GPUs running somewhere, and then the MCP server running somewhere else, okay. Now, you need to grant your client permission to talk to a server running somewhere at somewhere. Okay.
Yeah.
This is a typical flow that is solved by auth. Okay. You can have literally do this kind of exchanges and it works. Okay. However, AI moves too fast to implement this thing properly.
I agree.
Because that problem is super complex. Okay.
Yeah, because
It
who is the
requires,
grantor in that case? Who would you make the grantor?
yeah,
Because
that's
we're
the problem.
solving a machine-to-machine problem,
Yeah,
right?
it's a machine to machine problem, but you need to, so basically a user needs to grant a machine, uh, grants a machine capability to do something that on something that he owns, okay?
Yeah,
But there is a but, okay? Because nobody trusts the machine.
yeah,
So then the user needs to authorize the machine for every tool usage.
correct.
Okay, but the machine itself can actually do it. This is just code that is lapped on top for, you know, to make it more palatable for users. In reality,
Correct.
the machines could actually short circuit. And in fact, there is this joke of the only button you need to code is tab. Okay, there's been this joke has been
The
coming up.
auto-completion.
Yeah. So
But I agree with you. I think we are actually at the clash of two fast evolving realities. Sorry, of two realities growing at a different pace. The stability of OpenAPI that is required by all traditional system, and the new kind of like machine to machine interaction. Like you were saying, human grants two machines to communicate with each other. So I think is like you just said, is something that we already solved, addressed, solved many times. So it's not going to be like such a nuance to get it done. Yeah, I think last thing I wanted to touch about OpenAPI is a little bit about tooling and
ooh.
in general. I mean, where to start? Um, where to start? Well, let's start from where where the enterprise is stuck with Stoplight, Smart Bear. Well, now that they got acquired. Um, but if you imagine the ultimate tool for OpenAPI, what's in your head
So
to read,
my
edit, to do
okay,
anything with
so
OpenAPI?
my take, okay, I so first of all, I do all my edits in Vim, so I'm sorry, people. Okay,
The
I
architects want they want the UI.
yeah, I have no idea what they would want to use. So I am
Stop
I
Stoplight.
oh wow, okay,
Yeah, they want the fancy stuff, or they
okay,
use Insomnia.
yeah, or Postman, Luca, come
Or
on.
Postman. Yeah, I forgot about Postman.
You forgot about Postman, but Postman is big.
I generally forgot about it. Like to me, Postman doesn't exist anymore. Uh, but you know,
Well, it
we are,
costs so much money that I don't know who's paying all that ransom, but yeah.
I don't know. I think there are some good, you know, like you were saying, there are good automations. There is a good thing, but now we kind of like are back into building this kind of like humongous suite and IDEs to kind of like handle something like a freaking text file. You know what
Yeah.
I mean, right? It's
Yeah,
just
yeah.
like I
Oh, I
think,
agree. So for me, the definitive tool, okay, and especially in the Node.js JavaScript world, okay, are the next generation validation tools
mhm,
that combine TypeScript
I
with
agree.
JSON schema. So
Like for
basically,
example, because you and I kind of like work.
so there are a few of them that are possible. The one that I love the most, it's called Typebox, okay,
mhm.
and it has
I thought you loved the other one.
yeah, I also have like the other one, but it improved. So next version is actually better. So anyway, there is Typebox, and Typebox is actually not bad. Um, and yeah, just a second. Where is it? Yeah,
Well, we're gonna post all
Typebox.
the link, right? Also,
Yeah. Typebox has something like 31 million downloads per week, something impossible like that. Okay. Another one that is super popular for people, it's called Zod. Okay. And Zod in version 4 okay, is releasing, I think is not there yet, is beta, okay, is releasing conversion from Zod to JSON schema internally,
Ooh. So
okay.
instead of having their own format, they adjust to a
Well,
standard.
it yes, but it works decently well for code. It can work decently well for code first, okay, flows. But then in Fastify, we created this thing called the type providers. So you could specify your schemas using type box, JSON
God.
schema, the you name what, okay? Those things, okay, then are automatically typed into your routes, so that you have both the type safety and so the auto completion essentially, and the actual runtime safety of somebody actually validating that data. So it's pretty solid, I would say.
I'm not gonna ask you if you like Zod because I already know the answer. Uh,
I generically like I think the API should be. I prefer something that I prefer a definition where that definition can actually be um, printed on a file, okay, and is not
mhm.
something that only exists at runtime. We have been there a long time, and that doesn't work, okay, long term.
No,
You need to have a spec, okay, a definition that is generated there, and the generation of that API needs to be, a stock file, okay.
because
That
the
stock
architect loves to print it. Let's tell
pretty
the truth,
much, okay.
right? But
Also
it is
because you
true.
want, to communicate that with uh, uh, clients in different languages.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so if your specification, if the format that you're using is only exist in one language, okay, then you have a and this is where standard and specs makes all the sense. Okay,
I agree.
uh, you want the API defined in these ways. Okay, you don't want the API defined only by using something like
No,
a library. Okay,
no.
but once you have a spec, okay, can be an Open API spec and so on, or a GraphQL one. These are the two ones that you should be using, or even gRPC to some extent. Okay, um, then you're good.
So, Theo, today we cover a lot about OpenAPI, a lot of opinionated. We learn about extensions in specification, but I think we came a long way. It would be actually nice to actually get maybe Mark Leventur from Scalar,
Yeah,
or
we should.
I would love to get Eric, well, from the OpenAPI initiative, a guy that has been investing massively in getting OpenAPI really far. So let me try to hit them up and see if we can get them, maybe have a follow-up on OpenAPI, maybe with a deep dive on the new spec Arazzo, which is
Yes, or
extremely incredible.
let's do a session on the new Open API spec. I think that
Yeah,
would
and
be pretty good.
I can also ask the chairman,
Let's
very
do
cool
that.
guy, to kind of like walk us through to this. Um, well, I would say, Theo, that we are done for today. We banter enough,
We
and
did. We did.
then we see.
We did our weekly banter. Okay.
Then we invite everyone to come back next week, same time, same
Same
place.
times, same place.
Ciao,
Bye
guys. See you
guys.
next
Bye bye.
week. Ciao,
Bye.
ciao.
Bye bye.